The air inside the dimly lit interrogation room was thick with tension, the kind that clung to the walls and pressed against your chest. Agent Miguel Alvarez sat handcuffed to the cold metal table, his jaw clenched in disbelief. He was dressed casually in jeans and a leather jacket, blending in like any ordinary man in the city. But Miguel wasn't just anyone. He was an FBI agent, trained to navigate the nation's most perilous criminal investigations. Yet here he was, his badge and credentials shoved into a folder on the desk, ignored by the cop glaring at him across the table. "You think this is a joke, huh?" barked Officer Travis Simmons, his voice dripping with disdain. The burly officer leaned in, his blue uniform taut against his chest. "We got you, buddy. Don't think you're walking out of here without explaining why you were lurking near that jewelry store." "I've already told you," Miguel said, his voice measured but firm, his Filipino accent faint but distinct. "I was observing a suspect. I'm with the FBI. Check the ID in your folder." Simmons scoffed, pacing the small room. "Sure, and I'm the President of the United States. You expect me to believe that some random guy like you is a federal agent? I mean, come on." He shot Miguel a pointed look, the insinuation clear. Miguel's heart raced, not with fear, but with the simmering anger he was fighting to control. His training screamed at him to stay composed, to de-escalate. But Simmons' condescending tone and blatant disregard for his identity had pushed every button. "Call my supervisor," Miguel urged, his voice rising slightly. "Do it now, and you'll realize how badly you're screwing this up." Simmons smirked, crossing his arms. "Oh, don't worry. We'll get to that. Right after you tell me what you were really doing there. You don't look like any FBI agent I've ever met." The words hit like a slap, and Miguel's mind flashed back to years of training, years of working harder than anyone else to prove he belonged in a world where he was often underestimated. Now, because of one officer's bias and ego, his integrity and his freedom hung in the balance. "Officer Simmons." A new voice broke through the room like a lifeline. Simmons turned as another officer poked his head in. "We've got a situation, armed robbery down on Main Street. They need all available units." "No." Simmons hesitated, glancing between Miguel and the door. "I'm not done with you," he growled, jabbing a finger in Miguel's direction. "Stay put." As the door slammed shut, Miguel exhaled, his mind racing. This wasn't just a mistake. This was turning into a full-blown nightmare. Alone in the room, the weight of his situation bore down on him. Suddenly, he spotted his phone, left carelessly on the far end of the table. It was locked, but not out of reach. Miguel leaned forward, the chain of the handcuffs straining as he stretched toward it. Just a little further. The sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway snapped him back to reality. The door flew open again, and Simmons stormed back in, a new piece of paper in his hand and a triumphant gleam in his eye. "Got a warrant to check your prints," Simmons said smugly. "Let's see if you're really who you say you are. But I've got a feeling you're not gonna like how this turns out." Miguel's pulse thundered as he stared at Simmons. The stakes had never felt higher. What would the system believe, his impeccable record or the bias of a man who couldn't see past his own prejudice? And, more importantly, how much longer could Miguel afford to stay silent before things spiraled completely out of control? Will Miguel be able to prove his identity before Simmons escalates the situation further? And what happens when the real story behind the jewelry store incident comes to light? Stay tuned, and let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Miguel's shoes? Miguel's mind raced as Officer Simmons pulled out a fingerprint kit, the smug satisfaction on his face impossible to miss. The power dynamic was clear. Simmons was enjoying this far too much. Miguel couldn't help but feel that proving his identity wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about pride, prejudice, and a dangerous cocktail of unchecked authority. "Hands," Simmons barked, gesturing impatiently for Miguel to place his fingers on the ink pad. Miguel obliged, his movements deliberate. Despite the boiling frustration inside him, he maintained a stoic demeanor. If there was one thing he'd learned in his years as an agent, it was how to stay composed under pressure. As Simmons pressed Miguel's prints onto the sheet, his radio crackled to life. "Unit 12, we've got confirmation that the suspect in the Main Street robbery matches the description of the man detained at the scene. Requesting backup." Miguel froze. "Suspect. Detained. His eyes narrowed. That had to be Kyle "Snake" McCready, the armed robber he'd been tailing for weeks. The man was a slippery, dangerous felon who specialized in brazen heists and had managed to evade capture on multiple occasions. "This is it," Simmons muttered under his breath. "Got you now." Miguel couldn't stay silent anymore. "That's the guy I was observing," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "Kyle McCready. He's armed and dangerous, Officer Simmons. If you waste any more time with me, you're giving him a chance to get away." Simmons laughed dryly, shaking his head. "So now you're claiming to know the suspect personally? You just keep digging yourself deeper, pal." Frustration surged in Miguel's chest. "Listen to me. I've been working this case for months. Check my file, call the bureau, call anyone." Simmons ignored him, grabbing the fingerprint sheet and heading for the door. "Let's see what the system has to say about your story," he said with a smirk. As the door clicked shut behind Simmons, Miguel slumped back in his chair, his mind spinning. Time was slipping away. If Kyle McCready was involved in the robbery, then the stakes were higher than ever. Innocent lives could be in danger, and Miguel was stuck in this room, powerless to act. Suddenly, the faint buzz of his phone caught his attention again. It was still on the far edge of the table, tantalizingly close. Miguel glanced at the security camera in the corner of the room. The red light was off. The camera wasn't recording. Summoning all his strength, Miguel leaned forward, his fingers brushing the phone's edge. The handcuffs bit into his wrists, but he pushed through the pain. Finally, he snagged the phone and dragged it closer. With his thumb, he unlocked the screen using the biometric scanner. He quickly opened the messaging app, typing a single-word text to his partner, Agent Sarah Collins. "Detained." Within seconds, the 3 dots appeared, signaling her reply. "What happened? Where are you?" Miguel barely had time to respond before the door flew open, and Simmons stormed back in, holding a printout. He tossed it on the table in front of Miguel with a flourish. "Well, would you look at that?" Simmons sneered. "Your fingerprints match. FBI Agent Miguel Alvarez." Miguel exhaled sharply, relief flooding his chest. "There. Now can you release me so I can do my job?" But Simmons didn't move. Instead, he crossed his arms, glaring at Miguel. "You think this gets you off the hook? How do I know you didn't fake those credentials? Maybe you're a rogue agent or working with this McCready guy." Miguel stared at him in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? You ran my prints. You know who I am. Call my supervisor, Officer Simmons. Or better yet, step aside and let me help you catch McCready before this gets worse." Simmons leaned in, his face inches from Miguel's. "You don't tell me how to do my job," he growled. "And until I say otherwise, you're staying right here." Miguel's phone vibrated softly in his lap, and he glanced down. Another message from Sarah. "On my way. Don't move." Miguel felt a spark of hope. Sarah was one of the best agents he'd ever worked with, sharp, resourceful, and relentless. If anyone could cut through this mess, it was her. But before he could feel any sense of relief, Simmons' radio crackled again. "All units, shots fired at the Main Street robbery scene. Suspect is fleeing on foot. Requesting immediate backup." Simmons stiffened, his eyes narrowing. For a brief moment, he looked conflicted. Then he turned back to Miguel. "Stay put," he said coldly, grabbing his gear and heading for the door. Miguel watched him leave, the frustration boiling over. Every second that passed was another chance for McCready to escape, or worse. He clenched his fists, the cuffs rattling against the table. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sound of the slamming door echoed in Miguel's ears as Simmons rushed out, leaving him alone in the stifling interrogation room. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to act, but the cold steel of the handcuffs reminded him how powerless he was at the moment. His phone buzzed again in his lap, another message from Sarah. "Almost there. Hold tight." Miguel's thoughts raced. Time wasn't on their side. Kyle McCready was a ruthless criminal, and if he'd opened fire at the scene, the situation was already spiraling. He glanced around the room, searching for anything that could help him. The security camera was still inactive, the red light conspicuously off. This wasn't standard protocol for a precinct like this. It felt deliberate, almost as if Simmons wanted to keep this situation in the shadows. Miguel's phone vibrated once more, pulling him from his thoughts. This time, Sarah wasn't messaging. She was calling. The sound of the ringtone was deafening in the silent room. Miguel scrambled to muffle it, his hands awkwardly maneuvering the phone as the cuffs clinked against the table. He managed to answer just before the ringing could alert anyone. "Miguel," Sarah's voice was calm but urgent. "What's happening?" "I'm outside the precinct. Are you okay?" "Not really," Miguel replied quietly, keeping an eye on the door. "I'm cuffed in an interrogation room. Simmons doesn't believe I'm FBI, even after running my prints. He's on some kind of power trip." "Figures," Sarah muttered. "Stay put. I'll handle this." Before Miguel could respond, the line went dead. He exhaled slowly, his gaze locked on the door. He trusted Sarah, but a sinking feeling told him things would get worse before they got better. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, the sound of raised voices filtered through the walls. Miguel couldn't make out the words, but he recognized Sarah's voice, sharp, authoritative, and unyielding. The door burst open, and Sarah strode in, her suit immaculate and her expression ice-cold. Behind her, Simmons followed, his face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "Agent Alvarez," Sarah said, her voice clipped but professional. "Are you all right?" "Better now," Miguel replied, his tone dry. She turned to Simmons, her glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Release him." "No." Simmons hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I was just doing my job." "No," Sarah interrupted, stepping closer. "Your job was to confirm his identity and assist him. Instead, you've wasted precious time detaining a federal agent while a dangerous fugitive is at large. You've compromised this investigation." Miguel watched as Simmons' confidence wavered. Sarah's presence was commanding, and she wasn't giving him an inch. Reluctantly, Simmons pulled out the key and unlocked Miguel's cuffs. Miguel flexed his wrists, the relief palpable. "Thank you," he said to Sarah, his gratitude genuine. "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "McCready's on the move, and we're behind." Simmons cleared his throat. "I was about to deploy my team to—" "You've done enough," Sarah cut in, her tone icy. "We'll take it from here." Miguel couldn't suppress a small smirk as he stood. "You might want to sit this one out, Simmons," he said, his voice low. "This isn't your league." The tension in the room was suffocating, but Miguel didn't have time to dwell on it. He grabbed his phone and his badge from the table, nodding at Sarah. "Let's move." As they left the precinct, Sarah filled him in on the situation. McCready was spotted heading into a nearby industrial complex. SWAT's been notified, but they're stretched thin with the Main Street robbery. "It's just us for now." Miguel nodded, adrenaline kicking in. "We've got to move fast." He's desperate and armed. This could get ugly. They reached their unmarked SUV, the engine roaring to life as Sarah sped toward the industrial complex. Miguel checked his sidearm, his focus sharpening. The industrial area loomed ahead, a maze of warehouses and shipping containers. It was the perfect place for someone like McCready to hide and set a trap. Sarah parked a block away, and they moved in on foot, their weapons drawn. The air was heavy with tension, the faint hum of machinery the only sound. Miguel's eyes scanned every shadow, every corner. His instincts screamed that McCready was close. A sudden crash shattered the silence. Miguel and Sarah exchanged a glance before moving toward the sound, their steps cautious but deliberate. As they rounded a corner, they saw him. Kyle McCready, his wiry frame crouched behind a stack of crates, a gun clutched in his hand. "FBI!" Miguel shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "Drop the weapon." McCready's eyes darted between them, his expression a mix of fear and defiance. "You're not taking me in," he yelled, raising his gun. Everything happened in a blur. A gunshot rang out, the sound deafening. Miguel felt the heat of the bullet as it grazed his shoulder, pain flaring instantly. But he didn't falter. He fired back, the shot hitting McCready in the leg. The man collapsed with a cry of pain, his weapon skittering across the floor. Sarah moved in quickly, securing McCready as Miguel pressed a hand to his bleeding shoulder. "You okay?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with concern. "I'll live," Miguel replied, wincing. He looked down at MacCready, who was writhing on the ground. "You're done, Kyle." MacCready glared up at him, his bravado gone. "This isn't over," he spat. Miguel exchanged a glance with Sarah, the unspoken understanding between them clear. This case might be closed, but the fallout from today was just beginning. The ride back to the precinct was heavy with unspoken tension. MacCready sat cuffed in the back of the SUV, his face pale from the leg wound and his lips pressed into a thin, angry line. Miguel, his shoulder hastily bandaged, kept his eyes on the road ahead as Sarah drove in silence. The arrest should have felt like a victory. After months of chasing MacCready, they'd finally brought him down. But Miguel couldn't shake the lingering frustration, the gnawing anger over what had happened earlier. When they arrived at the precinct, Officer Simmons was waiting near the entrance, his expression sour as he watched Sarah and Miguel escort MacCready inside. "Got your guy, huh?" Simmons said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Yeah." Despite the delays, Miguel shot back, unable to resist. Sarah stepped in before the situation could escalate. "We need an interrogation room and medical attention for the suspect." "No." Simmons hesitated but eventually complied, signaling to another officer to take MacCready to holding. Miguel watched as MacCready was led away, then turned to Sarah. "We need to report this," Miguel said, his voice low. "What Simmons did back there, detaining me, ignoring my credentials, that's not something we can let slide." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "Agreed. But let's focus on MacCready first. We'll deal with Simmons after." Miguel sighed, the weight of the day pressing down on him. "Fine. Let's see if we can get anything useful out of MacCready." In the interrogation room, MacCready was already seated, his leg wound treated and bandaged. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips despite his obvious discomfort. "You two must feel real proud of yourselves," MacCready drawled. "But you're not gonna get anything out of me." "We'll see about that," Sarah said coolly, taking a seat across from him. Miguel stood to the side, arms crossed. "Let's make this easy, Kyle," Sarah continued. "Tell us who hired you for the Main Street robbery, and maybe we can work something out." MacCready laughed, the sound grating. "You think I'm scared of you? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Miguel stepped forward, his voice sharp. "We know exactly who you are, Kyle. A two-bit thief who thinks he's untouchable. But guess what? We got you. And if you don't start talking, you're going away for a long time." MacCready's smirk faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "You're barking up the wrong tree, Agent. The people I work for, they don't play nice. You think I'm bad? They make me look like a Boy Scout." Miguel and Sarah exchanged a glance. This was the first crack in MacCready's armor, and they weren't about to let it close. "Then help yourself out," Sarah pressed. "Give us names, details, anything we can use. Otherwise, you're going down alone." MacCready hesitated, his bravado slipping further. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You think Simmons here is the only bad cop in this city?" Miguel's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "There's a whole network," MacCready said, his tone conspiratorial. "Cops, politicians, businessmen, all of them in bed with the same people who hired me. And if you dig too deep, you're gonna find yourself in way over your head." Sarah leaned back, her expression unreadable. "Convenient story. But without evidence, it's just that, a story." MacCready's smirk returned. "Evidence? You think I don't have insurance? Check my locker at the industrial complex. You'll find what you're looking for." Miguel narrowed his eyes, trying to gauge whether MacCready was bluffing. There was something about the way he spoke, calm, calculated, that made Miguel think he might actually be telling the truth. Before they could press further, the door opened, and Simmons stepped in. "What's going on in here?" he demanded, his gaze darting between MacCready, Miguel, and Sarah. "Interrogation," Sarah said evenly. "Which you're interrupting." "I want to be part of this," Simmons said, crossing his arms. "Not happening," Miguel replied, his voice cold. "You've done enough damage today." Simmons' face reddened, but before he could respond, MacCready laughed. "This is rich," MacCready said, gesturing between them. "You're all on the same team, and you're tearing each other apart. Meanwhile, the real villains are out there laughing at you." Miguel ignored him, his focus on Simmons. "You've got a choice, Officer Simmons. Step out of this room, or I file an official report about your conduct today." "Your call." Simmons glared at him, then turned and stormed out without another word. When the door closed, McCready chuckled. "Looks like you've got your own problems to deal with, Agent." "Not as big as yours," Miguel shot back. As they left the interrogation room, Miguel turned to Sarah. "We need to check that locker. If McCready's telling the truth, this could be bigger than we thought." Sarah nodded. "I'll get the warrant. But Miguel, be careful. If what he said about a network is true, we might be walking into a hornet's nest." Miguel's mind raced as they prepared to follow this new lead. McCready's warning echoed in his ears. They had the suspect. But had they just uncovered something far more dangerous? The industrial complex loomed large in the night, its shadowy outline etched against the faint glow of the city skyline. Miguel and Sarah stood by their SUV, their breaths visible in the cold air. Sarah had the warrant in hand, a hard-won document she'd secured with no small amount of pushback from the precinct. "This feels too easy," Sarah murmured, scanning the area with sharp eyes. Miguel nodded, his instincts humming with unease. "McCready gave us this lead too willingly. Either he's trying to set us up, or he's desperate to save himself. Either way, we don't let our guard down." They approached the building cautiously, weapons drawn. The industrial complex was a labyrinth of abandoned warehouses and rusting equipment, every shadow a potential hiding spot. The locker McCready had mentioned was supposedly in a storage area on the second floor of the main building. As they entered, the air grew heavier, the scent of oil and decay hanging thick. Their footsteps echoed faintly on the concrete floors, amplifying the silence. "Keep an eye out for anything unusual," Sarah whispered, her tone tense. Miguel nodded, his focus sharp. His shoulders still throbbed from the earlier gunfight, but he pushed the pain aside. They moved as a unit, clearing each corner of the ground floor before ascending a creaky metal staircase. The second floor was lined with rows of dented lockers, their doors streaked with rust. Miguel and Sarah exchanged a glance before splitting up to search. Miguel reached the locker McCready had described, number 47, its paint chipped and faded. He tested the handle, but it was locked. Pulling out a small tool from his pocket, he worked quickly to pick the lock. A faint click signaled his success, and the door swung open with a groan. Inside was a black duffel bag, its zipper partially undone. Miguel carefully opened it, revealing stacks of cash, several USB drives, and a thick folder stuffed with papers. "Sarah," Miguel called softly, his voice cutting through the stillness. She was by his side in an instant, her flashlight illuminating the contents of the bag. "This is it," she said, her voice tinged with awe and suspicion. "If these drives and documents are legit, we've got the proof we need." Miguel nodded, but something didn't sit right. The air felt too quiet, too still. His instincts screamed at him to move. "Let's get out of here," he said, zipping the bag shut. As they turned to leave, a sharp click echoed behind them, a sound Miguel recognized instantly. "Drop it," a gruff voice commanded. Miguel and Sarah froze, their hands instinctively going up. In the dim light, a figure emerged from the shadows, a pistol trained on them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a black ski mask that concealed his face. "Step away from the bag," the man ordered. Miguel's mind raced. Whoever this was, he wasn't a random thug. He moved with precision, his stance steady. This man was trained, likely ex-military or law enforcement. "You're making a mistake," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "We're FBI. If you shoot us, you'll bring down the entire bureau on your head." The man chuckled darkly. "You think I'm worried about the FBI? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Miguel's eyes flicked to the side, assessing the distance between them and the stairs. If they moved quickly, they might have a chance. "What's in the bag?" the man asked, his gun unwavering. "Evidence," Miguel said carefully. "Evidence that ties McCready to a larger network. You don't want to get involved in this." "Too late," the man replied. Before Miguel could respond, a sudden noise from the ground floor interrupted them, a loud bang, followed by a burst of shouting. The man hesitated, his head turning toward the sound. Miguel didn't waste a second. He lunged forward, grabbing the duffel bag and knocking the man's arm aside as the gun discharged, the bullet ricocheting off a metal beam. "Move!" Miguel shouted, shoving Sarah toward the stairs. They bolted, the man's shouts and heavy footsteps close behind. As they descended, more masked men appeared at the building's entrance, weapons drawn. "We're surrounded!" Sarah yelled, her voice strained. Miguel's mind worked furiously, his eyes darting around for an escape route. Spotting a window to their left, he made a split-second decision. "Through there," he said, veering toward the window. Sarah didn't hesitate, following him as he smashed the glass with the duffel bag. They climbed through, landing on the ground outside just as a hail of gunfire erupted behind them. Miguel and Sarah sprinted toward their SUV, bullets whizzing past them. Miguel threw the duffel bag into the back seat as Sarah slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine with a roar. The tires screeched as they sped away, the masked men disappearing into the shadows behind them. Miguel leaned back, his chest heaving. "That was too close," he muttered. Sarah's hands tightened on the wheel. "Whoever they are, they're willing to kill to protect this. That means we've hit a nerve." Miguel nodded, his gaze falling on the duffel bag. "The question is, how deep does this go? And how many people are involved?" As they drove into the night, the weight of what they'd uncovered pressed down on them. This wasn't just about Kyle McCready anymore. They'd stumbled into something much bigger and much more dangerous. Miguel and Sarah didn't stop driving until they reached the FBI field office, a nondescript building tucked away in a quieter part of the city. The air was thick with tension as they carried the duffel bag into a secure evidence room. Every step felt heavier, the weight of what they had uncovered sinking in deeper with each passing moment. Inside the room, the harsh fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows on the bag as Miguel unzipped it. The stacks of cash, USB drives, and documents seemed to radiate a kind of dark energy, as though they were imbued with the danger they represented. Sarah grabbed a pair of gloves and carefully extracted the first USB drive. She plugged it into a laptop on the table, her face set in a mask of concentration. "Let's see what we've got." Miguel hovered over her shoulder as a folder of encrypted files appeared on the screen. Sarah frowned. "These aren't going to open without the right key. We'll need the tech team to crack this." "Check the papers," Miguel suggested, turning his attention to the folder stuffed with documents. As Sarah worked on the USB, Miguel sifted through the papers. Most were handwritten notes and spreadsheets with names, dates, and transactions. Some were marked with cryptic symbols, while others had familiar names Miguel recognized from high-profile cases, political offices, and even law enforcement. "Look at this," Miguel said, sliding a paper toward Sarah. It was a ledger with columns of payments and corresponding initials. At the bottom, one name stood out, T. Simmons. Sarah's eyes widened. "You think that's—" "It has to be," Miguel interrupted. "Officer Travis Simmons. McCready was right. There's a network, and he's part of it." Sarah leaned back, her expression dark. "This is bigger than we thought. If Simmons is involved, who else is? And how far up does this go?" Miguel clenched his fists. "We need to act fast. The people behind this won't sit idle once they realize we have this." Just as the weight of their discovery settled in, Miguel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Unknown number." He answered cautiously. "Alvarez." A deep, distorted voice came through the line. "Agent Alvarez, you've been digging where you don't belong." Miguel stiffened, motioning for Sarah to listen in. "Who is this?" "That's not important," the voice said. "What matters is that you hand over what you've taken. If you don't, things will get unpleasant." Miguel's grip on the phone tightened. "I don't respond to threats." "This isn't a threat," the voice replied, cold and calculated. "It's a promise. You have 24 hours to return what you took. Fail, and people close to you will pay the price." The line went dead, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Sarah's face was pale as she stared at Miguel. "They know. They've been watching us," Miguel said, his voice grim. He glanced at the duffel bag. "They knew we'd find this." "We need to move," Sarah said. "We can't stay here. If they have eyes on us, we're sitting ducks." Miguel nodded. "Let's secure the evidence and get it to HQ. We'll need reinforcements to take this network down." As they prepared to leave, The building's security alarm blared, a shrill sound that set their nerves on edge. Miguel drew his weapon, his heart pounding. "They're here." Sarah grabbed the duffel bag, and they moved quickly toward the exit, keeping low. The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls, accompanied by muffled voices. "They're covering the exits," Sarah whispered. Miguel's mind raced. The attackers were organized, and they weren't here to talk. He scanned the area, spotting a maintenance hatch near the back of the room. "Through there," he said, pointing. Sarah hesitated. "Are you sure it leads outside?" "No," Miguel admitted. "But it's better than waiting for them to corner us." They pried open the hatch and climbed through, the narrow tunnel barely wide enough to navigate. The sound of their pursuers grew louder as they moved, the clatter of boots on tile getting closer. Finally, they emerged into an alley behind the building, the cold night air hitting them like a shock. Miguel scanned the area, his weapon raised, as Sarah checked the bag. "We've got to get to a secure location," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Miguel nodded. "There's a safe house about 5 miles from here. We'll regroup there and figure out our next move." As they slipped into the shadows, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every step felt like a gamble, every corner a potential ambush. They'd unearthed something massive, something dangerous. And now, the clock was ticking. The safe house was a small, unassuming building tucked away on a quiet residential street, its plain exterior blending seamlessly into the neighborhood. Miguel and Sarah arrived under the cover of darkness, their nerves frayed but their resolve unshaken. Inside, the space was sparse but functional, outfitted with the basics: a desk, a few chairs, a cot, and a secure terminal linked to the FBI's private network. Miguel locked the door behind them, checking the windows before turning to Sarah. "We've got to move fast. Whoever's behind this won't let up. We need to decrypt those drives and get this intel to HQ." Sarah placed the duffel bag on the desk and pulled out the USB drives, her movements swift and precise. "I'll start with the tech team," she said, plugging the first drive into the terminal. "See if they can crack this encryption remotely." As Sarah worked, Miguel reviewed the documents again, his eyes scanning for anything they might have missed. Every page painted a picture of corruption and greed on an unfathomable scale. The ledger alone implicated over a dozen individuals in law enforcement, local government, and private industry. One name kept jumping out at him: T. Simmons. Miguel's jaw tightened. He knew Simmons had been corrupt, but seeing it laid out in black and white brought a fresh wave of anger. Simmons had not only obstructed justice, he was actively working with criminals like McCready to undermine the system he'd sworn to protect. "Miguel," Sarah said, breaking into his thoughts. Her voice was low, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the monitor. "You need to see this." Miguel moved to her side, his stomach knotting as he looked at the screen. The tech team had cracked one of the files, revealing a series of emails. They were correspondence between various individuals coordinating bribes, smuggling operations, and even assassinations to protect their network. "It's worse than we thought," Sarah said, her tone grim. "This isn't just a local operation. These people have connections across the country. Politicians, law enforcement, private security firms, they're all in on it." Miguel rubbed his temple, the weight of their discovery pressing down on him. "If this gets out, it'll shake the system to its core. But we need more. Enough to bring them all down at once." Suddenly, the safe house's security alarm blared, a piercing sound that made both agents reach for their weapons. Miguel moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The street outside was empty, but the sense of danger was palpable. "They found us," Sarah said, her voice tight. Miguel nodded, his mind racing. "We need to secure the evidence and get out of here." Before they could move, the lights in the safe house flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Miguel's pulse quickened as he flipped on a small tactical flashlight. Backup generators should kick in any second. Instead of the hum of power, the only sound was the faint creak of footsteps outside. "They've cut the power," Sarah whispered. "They're coming in." Miguel motioned for her to grab the duffel bag and move to the rear exit. "We stick to the plan. Get to the SUV and drive to HQ. If they want this evidence, they'll have to come through us." As they crept toward the back door, a loud crash echoed from the front of the house. Someone had breached the entryway. Miguel held up a hand, signaling Sarah to stop. He positioned himself near the corner of the hallway, weapon drawn, his heart pounding in his chest. A shadow moved in the doorway, and Miguel didn't hesitate. "FBI! Drop your weapon!" he shouted. The intruder responded with a burst of gunfire, forcing Miguel to duck behind the wall. Sarah returned fire from her position, her shots precise and deliberate. "Go!" Miguel shouted, covering her as she made her way toward the back exit. He followed close behind, his movements swift and calculated. They burst into the alley behind the safe house, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. Their SUV was parked just a few yards away, but the sound of approaching vehicles made their escape feel a world away. A black van screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley, its side door sliding open to reveal armed men in tactical gear. Miguel and Sarah exchanged a glance, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "Who are these people?" "They're not cops," Miguel muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. "No badges, no insignias," Sarah added. "Private contractors. Mercenaries." The men opened fire, and Miguel and Sarah dove behind a dumpster for cover. Bullets ricocheted off the metal, sparks flying in the darkness. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice strained. "We're pinned." Miguel glanced at the duffel bag, then back at the mercenaries advancing toward them. His mind raced. They couldn't afford to lose the evidence, but they couldn't take on a small army alone. "Plan B," Miguel said, pulling out his phone and sending a quick text to HQ, "Under attack. Need extraction. Location pinged." Sarah nodded, understanding instantly. "We hold them off until backup arrives." The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire and shouted commands. Miguel and Sarah worked as a seamless team, covering each other as they moved toward the SUV. The mercenaries were relentless, their tactics precise, but Miguel and Sarah's training and determination kept them one step ahead. Finally, the sound of sirens cut through the chaos. Red and blue lights illuminated the alley as FBI vehicles swarmed the scene. The mercenaries, realizing they were outnumbered, retreated into the night. As the agents secured the area, Miguel and Sarah climbed into their SUV, the duffel bag safely in tow. "This isn't over," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "They'll come after us again." Miguel nodded, his jaw set. "Let them. We're not stopping until we take them all down." The FBI field office was a hive of activity as Miguel and Sarah arrived with a duffel bag. Agents swarmed around them, securing the evidence and setting up an immediate debrief. The tension in the air was palpable. Miguel's shoulder still ached from his earlier injury, but he pushed the pain aside, his focus sharp. Assistant Director Marcus Langdon, a grizzled veteran with a commanding presence, greeted them in the secure evidence room. "Alvarez, Collins, I've been briefed on your situation. Do we have enough to act?" Miguel nodded, sliding the decrypted documents and USB drives across the table. "This evidence implicates key figures in law enforcement, politics, and private security. It confirms McCready was part of a larger network, a network that's willing to kill to protect itself." Langdon flipped through the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is explosive. If what you've uncovered holds up, it'll be one of the biggest takedowns in Bureau history." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. "We need to act quickly. The people behind this know we have the evidence. They've already sent mercenaries after us." Langdon nodded. "We'll assemble a task force. But first, I want Simmons brought in. His name is all over these files, and he's clearly a key player." Miguel's jaw tightened. "I'll handle Simmons." Hours later, Miguel and a small team of agents stood outside Simmons' suburban home. The street was quiet, the houses dark except for the faint glow of porch lights. Miguel's stomach churned with a mix of anger and determination. As they approached the front door, Simmons opened it, a smug grin on his face. "Agent Alvarez, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Miguel didn't bother with pleasantries. "You're under arrest, Simmons. We've got evidence linking you to McCready's network and the broader conspiracy." Simmons' grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic. "You're making a mistake, Alvarez. I'm clean." Miguel stepped closer, his voice low and cold. "The only mistake was underestimating me." The agents moved in, cuffing Simmons as he protested. Miguel watched as he was led away, satisfaction mingled with a grim awareness of how much work still lay ahead. Back at HQ, the interrogation room was silent as Simmons sat across from Miguel and Sarah. His arrogance had faded, replaced by a nervous energy that he tried to mask with bravado. "You think you've won?" Simmons sneered. "You have no idea how deep this goes. Even if you take me down, others will step in. You can't stop it." Miguel leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "We'll see about that. But here's the thing, Simmons. Once we're done, there won't be anyone left to step in." Simmons hesitated, then laughed bitterly. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just some local racket. It's everywhere. You think your badge makes you untouchable? The people I work for don't care about the law." Sarah crossed her arms, her voice calm but firm. "Then start talking. Give us names, locations, operations. Maybe we can work something out." Simmons stared at them, weighing his options. Finally, he exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "Fine, I'll talk. But only if you can guarantee protection. Because when they find out I flipped, I'm a dead man." Simmons' confession was a goldmine. He provided names of high-ranking officials, details of illegal operations, and locations of safe houses used by the network. Armed with this information, the FBI launched a massive operation, raiding multiple locations and arresting dozens of individuals across the country. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. News outlets exploded with coverage of the corruption scandal, naming politicians, officers, and executives who had been implicated. The arrests sent shockwaves through the system, forcing institutions to reckon with the extent of the infiltration. In the weeks that followed, Miguel and Sarah found themselves at the center of the storm. They testified before grand juries, worked long hours to ensure the case was airtight, and dealt with the aftermath of their harrowing journey. One evening, as the chaos began to subside, Miguel sat in his office, staring at the evidence board that had guided their investigation. Photos of McCready, Simmons, and others stared back at him, a stark reminder of the cost of justice. Sarah walked in, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Long day?" she asked, handing him a cup. Miguel nodded, taking a sip. "Feels like we've only scratched the surface. But we made a dent." Sarah sat across from him, a small smile on her lips. "A big dent. And we proved something. They're not untouchable." Miguel chuckled, the weight on his shoulders easing slightly. "Guess not." They sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of their work hanging between them. Finally, Miguel spoke, his voice soft but resolute. "Thanks for having my back, Sarah. Couldn't have done this without you." She smiled. "Anytime. Now, let's get some rest. Something tells me this isn't the last time we'll face something like this." Miguel nodded, a sense of calm washing over him. They'd won this battle, but the fight for justice was far from over. And he was ready for whatever came next. What did you think of Miguel and Sarah's journey? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories that keep you on the edge of your seat.